Welcome to the Bradley J. Show. Welcome to the Bradley J. Show. It looks like we're live. Rich Rubino is with us, who's an author. Show him one of your books. It's a cool trivia book. And we're going to talk about my theory that neither Trump nor DeSantis will be the nominee for the GOP. And of course, that is a wild speculation, but not being a professional, I don't mind making wild speculations. I don't mind being wrong. I'm wrong, I'm wrong a lot, but no one remembers those, and I make sure that on the ones I'm right, no one forgets. So, I'm kind of basing this on President Trump is a record of losing now, and the Republicans want to win. And while 40% of all Republicans say they'll vote for Trump, that's not going to be enough probably to win, and they want to win, and I'm wondering if someone will step forward or something will happen. A new candidate will step forward, or new donors step forward, or a new Never Trump movement will form. And of course, I don't think DeSantis is a dud, and it's sort of funny how he's attacking his number one business in his state. He just gets involved in these small local little fights and doesn't seem very presidential. I don't see either of them winning, and I know the Republicans want to win. I feel like something can happen between now and then so that I'm right. And of course, there's history to take a look at, and I have no idea how what I'm saying measures up historically, and that's why Rich Rubino is here.
Yep.
Any precedent for what I'm saying being possible?
Yeah, I mean, there is theoretically, but we're never really seen a precedent quite like this. I mean, for example, in 1964, Nelson Rockefeller, the governor of New York, was the early front runner. He was the establishment candidate. The Republican Party tended to nominate establishment-friendly candidates. Eventually, when it got to the California primary, there was a big issue because Rockefeller had been divorced. His ex-wife was remarrying, and Barry Goldwater won California, and with it, he won all the delegates because it was winner take all at the time in the state of California, and landed up garnering the nomination. Another example would be 1976. There was a poll taken in late 1974 of 31 candidates for the Democratic presidential nomination, and the name Jimmy Carter, the outgoing governor of Georgia, was literally not on the list. That's how small his name recognition was. What happens by 19...
At what time was that? What point?
This was in late 1974, and he was a nominee by 1976. Now, at the time, the early front runner was Senator Henry Scoop Jackson of Washington, who was very much labor friendly. Some people thought he was actually a stalking horse, that he was going to get in the race and then he was going to drop out, and former Vice President Hubert Humphrey would come in and kind of take a lot of those labor-friendly supporters. But he was not a strong front runner. He was a weak front runner. Part of that was based on name recognition. Part of that is based on establishment support. In this case, though, and another example, I guess, would be 2004, actually. Believe it or not, in 2003, and it's hard to think of this now, do you know who the early front runner was in 2003 for the Democratic presidential nomination?
No.
Joe Lieberman. Believe it or not. Imagine that happening today. The senator from Connecticut. Part of that, two reasons. First of all, he was Al Gore's running mate in 2000. So accordingly, he garnered a lot of name recognition because of that, because he was a national figure, had almost ecumenical name recognition. That helped him. Also because he was seen as the heir to the Clinton-Gore ideology, which helped him certainly with African Americans. Bill Clinton was extremely popular, had a job approval up to 93% with African American community. Al Gore benefited from that when he ran in 2000 in the primaries, defeating Bill Bradley. And then Joe Lieberman became the descendant of a lot of that support. But a lot of it, frankly, was just name recognition. And once the Democratic voters figured out that Joe Lieberman was a vociferous support for the Iraq War, for example, for free trade, for example, he gradually dissipated. He was not, shall we say, a major contender in the actual race. He started to talk about Joe Mentum, saying that he was actually going to start winning in places like New Hampshire. He didn't win. Eventually, he dropped out, but he was the early front runner. And then, look at his fortune because he'd support the Iraq War. A few years later, there was a challenge to him by the current governor of Connecticut, Ned Lamont, in the Democratic primary. Ned Lamont actually defeated him in the primary. This is running for re-election to the United States Senate. But ran on with Lieberman. He kind of hedged his bet. He said, if I'm not going to win the primary, I might as well get the signatures to run as a third party, which was called Connecticut for Lieberman. And there was no primary in the Connecticut for Lieberman party because you probably have to be named, last name was Lieberman, and he ended up winning in a three-way race. But he was the early front runner that year. But this time around, I think that Donald Trump, all he has to do, he doesn't have to win a majority really anywhere. All he has to do, because most of the primaries and caucuses are winner take all, is do exactly what he did last time. He didn't win any contest until New York, which came relatively late in the game, where he actually won 50% of the vote. Before that, he'd win 39, 40, 41% of the vote. And there are people in the Republican Party that have an amorous relationship with him. They would absolutely die for this person. They are just so fidelitous to Donald Trump, if you will. Yes.
And why is that? Especially since it's likely he will lose in the general.
Couple of things.
Yeah.
Couple of things. First of all, because they view him as the one person that is against the swamp in Washington. Many of his supporters were not traditional Republicans. They were not particularly supportive of George W. Bush or John McCain or Mitt Romney. They kind of did not like the political process. Some of them might not necessarily even be Republicans. They might be conservative leaning independents, but they saw him as somebody who kind of challenged or take on, if you will, the Republican establishment last time around. Really, he had 17 other major candidates. He kind of picked them off one by one. He'd go after Rand Paul first, then he'd go after Ted, then he'd go after Marco Rubio, then he'd go after Ted Cruz, and they saw him as taking on the establishment. There was a very fascinating account where Ted Cruz is in the Indiana primary, and he's greeting voters, and voters were very much Trump supporters, and he was saying essentially, you're being lied to, you're being misled. And one of them said, well, what about your wife working at Goldman Sachs? So that's part of it. Trump's seen as an anti-corporatist, anti-war, anti-free trade in many respects. That is what really brings these people to Donald Trump. Now, what would they have thought of him 10 years ago? I don't know. Plus, the other thing he has is there are a lot of evangelicals. While the evangelicals may not particularly like his moral life, they do believe that he gave them 3 Supreme Court justices, as well as potentially over 300 lower court justices, and they got Roe v. Wade overturned. So that's why they view him essentially as their tribune. And I really don't see a scenario where they aggress stage left from his campaign. Now, the question is going to be, people will say, well, look at 2022. Why did the Democrats only win 14 seats in the House of Representatives? We had a president with a job approval of about 41%. And why did the Democrats actually pick up a seat in the United States Senate? So what would Trump's argument be? He'll say, well, the reason it happened in the United States Senate is because Mitch McConnell's PAC, the establishment of the Republican Party, was giving money to candidates in primary, was giving money to candidates who were challenging, who are establishment-oriented candidates, and including, by the way, sometimes in the general election, they were giving money to liberal candidates like Lisa Murkowski in Alaska, for example. And that's why they were spending so much money. They should have spent all that money on folks like Herschel Walker in Georgia. So they would essentially say, we really should have won that. We really should have won that election, but it was the establishment of the Republican Party. And that's where the crux of that loyalty originates.
But the establishment, like Mitch McConnell will say, that it wasn't about not spending money on Herschel Walker. It was the fact you backed Herschel Walker, and people like him.
Yeah, and Trump people will say essentially, and this doesn't only go for Herschel Walker. This goes for candidates around the country. Dr. Oz in Pennsylvania, for example, They will say, well, if Mitch McConnell and the Republican establishment had backed these candidates in the general election to the hilt, as opposed to giving kind of flaccid support for them, these candidates would have won. So it was not Donald Trump's fault. And they would say that Donald Trump is the person who's trying to essentially reform the Republican Party in his image, in an anti-establishment image. And they really see this as an internecine battle between the establishment folks like Mitch McConnell, and Donald Trump. And Donald Trump is their tribune, and Donald Trump is the person that they would essentially support until the last dog dies, as Bill Clinton.
So who's gonna win this? Oh, before I get to that question, I'm starting to see this next presidential election cycle. Well, the last presidential election cycle in January 6th as a dry run for an actual civil war coming up in the next cycle. It seems to me that Trump will not say that he will abide by the results of the election, and it seems like while he was in office, put situations in place legally that would make it easier for him to challenge election results. If Trump is the nominee and the candidate and the general, I don't see a tidy ending to that election. I see him wanting to expand on what happened January 6th, tenfold, 100-fold, wants an actual civil war. What do you think about that? And have you seen any measures taken to prevent that?
Any measures taken to prevent that? No. And frankly, if it happens, it's going to happen. I think the last time we've seen a circumstance similar to this was 1968, when Hubert Humphrey won the Democratic presidential nomination. Because frankly, and this is, some people would say, well, why doesn't the establishment of the Republican Party, why don't they just, if that convention, they have the final say, why don't they overrun the primaries and just essentially nominate the person they want in kind of the smoke-filled room, someone who's more establishment oriented? Well, they tried that in 68. Hubert Humphrey participated in one primary, South Dakota. He came in third place. Eugene McCarthy was opposed to the Vietnam War. He was winning in the primaries. And then at the convention, essentially, the establishment of the Democratic Party, which had control over a lot of delegates, a lot more than were at the primary, frankly, they purloined it from Eugene McCarthy, and Hubert Humphrey wins the nomination. Hubert Humphrey had been a supporter of the Johnson policy in Vietnam. So what happens? Essentially, you have riots out in Grant Park, and you can certainly see the footage of that. And that is exactly what would happen. I think, by the way, if Donald Trump does not muster the nomination for president, if it is somebody else, I can see that scenario essentially in play between kind of the establishment of the Republican Party and the Trump supporters, unless he loses. If he loses, by 13, 14 points,
Are you talking nomination or general?
Oh, in the nomination. If he doesn't win the nomination, I'm
talking about if he gets into the general and loses, like last time.
I can see that scenario. I can see that scenario happening. I can see that scenario happening as well. Particularly if he concedes the election and says, "Look, I lost the election," then no, I don't think that's going to happen. If he does not concede and he says essentially, once again, we won this election, and he'll say we won essentially 3 elections in a row, then yeah, I think there's definitely going to be something, and then something will certainly matriculate.
I understand why now, thanks to you, why people stick with Donald Trump, even though it's likely he will lose a general. But why would those same folks insist on going along with him when he says when it's rigged, after they have seen the Proud Boys be convicted of sedition, after they've seen Fox have to pay $7.75 million bucks? The whole election rig thing has been proven in all kinds of ways to not be true. Why do they still buy into it?
Well, Donald Trump continues to say that it is true. He just said it in his town hall meeting this past Wednesday night. He said that there were people.
But so all 63 judges, doesn't matter. The court case with Fox doesn't matter. The voting machines were not rigged. They were not space lasers. None of anything that resembles a fact matters at all.
Well, you got to remember where some people, and we're in this scenario, people aren't watching. It used to be in the days in this, you could either watch Huntley and Brinkley or Walter Cronkite for your news, and most people trusted both of them. Okay? We're in a scenario now where there are 19,000 different news sources, one of them being, you say the word the media, and the media is not this one big organism. The media is many parts. It's not kind of the synodoche is kind of the media in terms of one term, where there's so many different parts of it. And one of those parts, frankly, is social media. And a lot of people are just getting their information from social media or from sources that they agree with. Mm-hmm. So if you're in these kind of silos, and you're in these ideological silos, and you're hearing this information, then essentially you're saying, yeah, essentially there is a plot against Donald Trump. Donald Trump talked about the biggest witch hunt in the history of the country, for example. And there are people that genuinely, I think, believe that there is this essentially going on against Donald Trump, and that it's the establishment, and that the judges are all part of it, the deep state, if you will, and that they're trying to take on somebody who took on the swamp. So I think that there are people who genuinely in the Republican Party, first certainly, that believe that the election was rigged and that Donald Trump really won. And if Donald Trump, as long as he keeps on saying that, there's going to be a base of support. Now, is it going to be the majority of the country? No. Is it going to be a plurality of the country? Perhaps. It's going to be, all he needs is that 40% or so, and he has to win the Republican primary. And if you look at, you have still a majority of Republican voters, whether they support Donald Trump for president in 2024 or not, if you ask them the question, who won the 2020 presidential election, they will still acerbate Donald Trump.
I wonder if they believe it, because people don't. Lots of times, people don't answer honestly in polls. They answer the thing they think is cool to say.
Well, there is, and this goes for anything. There is, I think, the affinity group supposition. That's my supposition anyway. The idea that people want to be part of a group, and part of that group is the ideologically dispossessed that support Donald Trump. And it's not necessarily about Donald Trump per se. It's about wanting to be in kind of this coterie of people that believe in Donald Trump, that believe in his ideology. And as a result, you go on social media, for example, and you say something in favor of Donald Trump, and 17 other people come and essentially agree with you. So it's like being, just like being a fan of it's like being a Padres fan. If no matter what the San Diego Padres do, you want to be part of that group. You can say, I'm a San Diego Padres fan.
I couldn't agree with you more. This has gone beyond who you think will be a good president. This is, in America, it's about your identity.
Yes.
And people want an identity. And it became cool to be identified as a pro-Trump person no matter what, because it made you stand out and it got you attention. And I couldn't agree with you more that this is now a personal identity thing. And therefore, no amount of factual data will interfere with, I want to identify as one of the rebels. And so I'm not going to pay any attention to any facts.
I don't think, and it goes on the other side as well. There's an echo chamber. And you have this certainly on social media, you have this on the internet, you have people going only to sources where they agree with. And when they're getting information, they're not getting information, they're not saying, I'm going to look at a complete uncolored perspective, and I just want to hear the facts. A lot of people go there and they immediately say, I want my facts to be reinforced. So they go there and they listen to sources. And you can, if you want, you can pretty much have any opinion, including the opinion that the earth is flat. You can go to sources that will agree with you, because there is a flat earth society, and they will continue to say that. And if you, by the way, when we said, if you want to be a flat earther, you can get people that you can make a scientific argument. You can go and you can hear people saying that. And then somebody comes up and says, what are you talking about? Immediately you say, well, you're part of the deep state that thinks the earth is round. You don't know that it's actually flat, and you've been lied to for all these years. And whether you agree with it or not, all of a sudden you're garnering this attention, and you're part of an affinity group, and that affinity group is people who know that the earth is flat, rather. It
is very true what you say. I actually interviewed a spokesperson for the Flat Earth Society. And so there's two things that are going on. It is, I identify as a flat earther because it gets me attention. And
you said that?
No, but it's clear. The other thing is, just like with the Trump folks, there are talking points, there are buzzwords they say that they've said over and over because it's what they do. They have that argument at every dinner party or wherever they go. So it's difficult to argue with them because they have a flip answer for everything you might say, just like with the Trump folks. So Joe asked an interesting question. What happens if Trump wins free and clear? What would he, how would he operate in his second term? Would he just blow things up? Would he try to be a decent president? Would he release all criminals? Would he release all the Proud Boys? What would he do?
I think he would. And he, by the way, he could have done this his last days in office too, and he didn't do this, which I think is a question, because he says recently he was asked if he would pardon the folks who have been in jail for January 6th. And he said, well, he would do it to a lot of them. He wouldn't do it to all of them because some of them may have been out of control. So theoretically, yeah, he could certainly issue a lot of pardons for them. The thing that will be interesting with Donald Trump, though, what if the Democrats maintain a slight majority in the United States Senate? I can't think of one Democrat right now who would actually work with Donald Trump on pretty much anything, because he's been such a pariah. And that includes Joe Manchin if he gets reelected. That includes everyone from Joe Manchin on the left to Bernie Sanders. I mean, on the right of the party to Bernie Sanders on the left. Imagine if there is, for example, some sort of, if there has to be a negotiation, can you imagine Chuck Schumer and Hiram Jeffries and the Democratic Party coming and meeting like they usually do with the president of the United States, and they kind of negotiate back and forth? He's such a pariah to the Democratic Party. I can't imagine that actually happening. So what would he have to do? He would have to kind of go over their heads, if you will. He would have to work to try to get something through. For example, if the Republicans maintain control of the House, he'd have to have almost uniform support. And part of that he actually probably could get, because for a lot of these Republicans, the districts have been so gerrymandered that if they don't vote for his proposals, he can say, I'm going to support a primary challenge against you. Used to be incumbent presidents almost never support primary challenges against incumbents, even if the incumbent is somebody like Lincoln Chafee in Rhode Island, who was against George W. Bush and just about everything. Bush still supported him. Laura Bush went there, campaign. John McCain went there and said campaign. Donald Trump has broken that precedent. He'll campaign against incumbent members in their own primaries, but then you have to get to the United States Senate, and for him to get legislation through the House and through the Senate, if the Democrats have a slim majority, I don't see how that necessarily happens. And you say, well, what about someone like Joe Manchin if he does get reelected? Well, Joe Manchin is 74 years old. He's probably in his last term in the United States Senate. If he gets reelected, he doesn't necessarily have that incentive that he has to do it because of the state of West Virginia, is because it's such a perilous state for Democrats. So it'd be very hard for him to get legislation passed. So my guess it would be, if he does get reelected, he'll be spending a lot of time, continuing doing these rallies, for example. But in terms of actually getting legislation passed, he's going to, if he has an inordinate majority in the House and the Senate, then yeah, I think he can frankly get a lot of his legislation passed. And a lot of that would probably be traditional Republican legislation. One thing he has said he will not touch entitlements. He will not touch Medicare. He will not touch Social Security. Senator Cassidy, a Republican from Louisiana, and Angus King, an independent from Maine who caucuses with the Democrats, are proposing that saying that they have to do something about Social Security, because in 10 years, essentially, they will face a crisis in Social Security. Donald Trump has said he will not do anything about that. So, will he hold to his word on that? I don't know. I would assume he probably would, but it'll be very interesting to see how he actually gets legislation through through the House, through the Senate, unless he has extreme majorities. And we're in such a bifurcated time right now, I can't see a scenario where you have these kind of elephantine majorities that FDR or LBJ enjoyed.
Speaking of House and Senate, how do you imagine that the Freedom Caucus, which is kind of the face of the party now, even though not a majority of the party, the face of the party, and your Marjorie Taylor Greens and your George Santos, how will all that's going on, in your opinion, affect the results of the next election when it comes to those down ticket seats?
George Santos, I think, will basically be a non-factor. He's essentially a congressman from New York. I think most people will look at George Santos as kind of an anomaly, if he's even still in office by then. I think that, and frankly, every Republican just about would pretty much condemn George Santos as soon as they'd ask a question. They'd say, "Why are you supporting George Santos?" I think the ones who would say that, the ones who actually would say that he should leave Congress, or pretty much would be independent enough from him. You already have members of the New York delegation saying that. So he's going to be a non-factor. Marjorie Taylor Greene, though, she's somebody that I think first of all, there are very few seats that are actually going to be competitive, as there always are in a general election, because we're in such a bifurcated time, we're in such a gerrymandered time, that in a lot of Republican and Democrats, the only way they can possibly lose a seat is in the primary, if the Democrat is gone too far to the center, or if the Republican is gone too far to the center and someone challenges them respectively from the left or the right end of the political spectrum. Now, in the general election, for those Democrats and Republicans that actually are in competitive races, very rare again, Marjorie Taylor Greene, and the Democrats want this. The fact that they had her when Joe Biden gave his State of the Union address and she yells liar, and she gets up and the camera focuses right on her, that I can see being on just about every political advertisement against kind of moderate Republicans in places like upstate New York, for example, saying this is where the Republican Party has gone, then say this congressman voted 87% of the time with Marjorie Taylor Greene, which is probably true. But usually when you see those polls, by the way, they also include non-controversial pieces of legislation, like naming courthouses, for example, naming post offices. So it's technically true, but she's going to be the face card of the party, and just about every Democrat running against every Republican in a swing seat is going to try to allegate their opponent with Marjorie Taylor Greene. Frankly, they're going to try to do it with Lori Boebert. I don't think they'll do it with George Santos. And if Donald, in a place like upstate New York, where there's a vulnerable incumbent Republican, then yeah, I think Donald Trump will also be the face card. You'll see a picture of Donald Trump, and then you'll see a picture of that Republican. If it's somebody other than Donald Trump as a Republican Party nominee, obviously they're going to try to vilify them, but it's kind of a different case they're going to have to make because they cannot use kind of the foibles of Donald Trump. They have to kind of go back to square one and figure out a scenario how they can take on that Republican. And one of the ways they could do that is try to tether that candidate to Donald Trump and ask him the question and try to make it very uncomfortable for that Republican. Say, well, do you think Donald Trump won the last election? And if he says, yes, I think he won the last election, that alienates people in the center. If he says, no, I think that Donald Trump actually, I think Donald Trump actually lost the election, then potentially many Trump supporters who are going to be who are going to have a lot of power in this election if Trump's not the nominee might potentially say, you know what, I'm going to vote for a third party this time, or I'm not going to vote, or I'm even going to write in Donald Trump. So it just puts them between a rock and a hard place.
Answering that question, you'd think you'd have to stick with your answer, but who's the guy in New Hampshire, the New Hampshire candidate who the day after the primary said, oh, you know what? Trump didn't win after all. Remember that?
Dan Bullock, yeah.
He was unabashed in the way he said. It was the day after. Oh, yeah, that thing about Trump. Yeah. Nobody cares. Nobody cares. How often does this happen? And is it ever effective? When, let's say there were some never Trump Republicans kind of working together with the Democrats to switch over for the primary and vote for a non-Trump in the primary. Is that effective? I would think it would be.
The only time there are a few times this has been effective. In Texas back in 2008, and in Texas had an open. Yeah, first of all, the state has to have an open primary, meaning members of another party. They can either become an independent. They can either change the party registration for just that election, vote for somebody else, then go back to being a Democrat. Or if it's an open primary, essentially, you can be an independent, or you can be an independent that leans the other, say a Democratic leaning independent, and then go and vote for a Republican. Like New Hampshire has an open primary, whereas Iowa has caucuses, and you have to be an actual registered Republican to participate in. So it all depends on the state. But in 2008, in the state of Texas, Rush Limbaugh was trying to make it as miserable potentially for the Democrats as they had a real brutal internecine fight between Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, and Barack Obama appeared to be running away with the nomination. So Rush Limbaugh was saying for his supporters, was saying in Texas to essentially they have an open primary, vote in the Democratic primary, it's called Operation Chaos, and vote for Hillary Clinton, just so this continues to go as far as it can, and actually win all the way to the end in South Dakota before Hillary Clinton landed up essentially announcing that she was dropping out of the race. But so yeah, I mean that is very possible. It's a very calculated strategy. It's very hard to actually actually discern and to actually actuate and effectuate, if you will, because you have to tell voters, and a lot of voters are low propensity because they actually have lives. They're not thinking about politics all day long. You have to tell them, I want you to come out and I want you to do this and I want you to vote for this person, not because it's your favorite choice, because I want chaos in that party, or because I want that party to nominate somebody that is essentially that is more moderate. It's very hard to do that in practice. But obviously in theory, it's something that certainly could happen.
It would kind of have to happen organically, like a wave of aware kind of activist young people would decide this is what we're going to do.
In 2000, George W. Bush won Iowa. Then in New Hampshire had an open primary. It's actually sort of happened. There were a lot of independent voters on the Democratic side. You had Al Gore and Bill Bradley duking it out, and Bill Bradley. The thought was Bill Bradley just lost Iowa, so a lot of these independent voters who potentially could have had proclivities toward Bill Bradley said, why don't we instead go over to the Republican side? So they went over and voted for John McCain. McCain ends up winning by 16 points over Bush. And this ends up hurting Bill Bradley because Bill Bradley did not garner a lot of those independent voters. So the result was Bill Bradley lands up winning literally no primaries in that election. But John McCain became kind of the independent Republican, and it did work for him. but eventually, of course, he landed up losing the nomination to Bush.
Okay, you say 40% of Republicans will vote. You say that 40% of Republicans say they will vote for Donald Trump, no matter what. If the Never Trump faction becomes large enough, and only if it becomes large enough and strong enough, why wouldn't Liz Cheney have a chance? Because her only knock in the party is that she was anti-Trump. So she already doesn't have any of those voters. If it's only 40% saying, I'm going to vote for Donald Trump, there's a significant part who would vote for other than Donald Trump. And why wouldn't Liz Cheney be a good other than Donald Trump?
Well,
I mean, she does have the credentials. She's pretty mean, and her father was even meaner. You know,
well,
why wouldn't she be good?
Well, first of all, she lost her re-election bid in 2022, and this in the primary.
Yeah,
and these are Republican primary voters, and this was the largest loss of any incumbent running in a primary. This was the second largest loss in 60 years.
Yeah,
60 years she lost. And there are so few. First of all,
that's that state though.
You're right. It is Wyoming.
I've been there, and I have seen these people, and so I get that.
Except for the Jackson Hole area, which is kind of this liberal enclave.
Right.
Teton County, I think the wealthiest county in the county, just about in the country. And then you have the rest of Wyoming, and you have a few, parts of Labor, parts of Cheyenne. But generally speaking, it is a very, not even necessarily conservative as much as I think it's libertarian, just kind of stay off my back. Government type of a state, but part of it is the Republican Party has to move so far away from Bush type Republicans, the neoconservatives. How many? You go back to certainly her father and her support for the Iraq War. I don't know any Republican now that's an established. That's even. I don't know any. I've never heard a Republican talking or defending the Iraq War, defending Dick Cheney in the Iraq War. Dick Cheney had a 22% job approval when he left office.
Yeah.
He's not at the Bush. I don't know if you think of any Republican that would use George W. Bush in the fundraising circuit or use Dick Cheney on the fundraising circuit in 2024 running in a primary. Okay. They're persona non grata right now, so I don't see where her general constituency is. Now you would say, well, okay, would there be some Democrats that would come over in places like New Hampshire and vote? Well, my guess is those Democrats, when they find out that she had one of the most conservative records of any member of the House of Representatives,
right?
When they find out where she stands on just about everything other than gay marriage and Donald Trump, they'll find out that they're voting for somebody who's pretty much a full spectrum, conservative, and the daughter of Vice President Dick Cheney, who was kind of the political antichrist back when he was actually vice president. So I don't see where her natural constituency is, but I can see a constituency for another anti-Trump Republican. And you could say, well, what about Asa Hutchinson? I think Asa Hutchinson, I think he's going to kind of fade through the woodwork in many respects. I don't think he really has the charisma. I don't think he has a natural constituency. But Governor Chris Sununu in New Hampshire is somebody who could be kind of a wild card. Do I think he can win? No. But potentially he'll be in the state of New Hampshire. He's extremely popular. He just won re-election with almost 60% of the vote there. He's a potential candidate for president. And he potentially, assuming that in the Democratic side, you're just going to have Joe Biden. And well, actually, you're not really. I mean, you're going to have a Democratic primary, but essentially, it's going to be almost an outlaw primary because Joe Biden has essentially moved the primaries for South Carolina will be first, and New Hampshire could have their Democratic primary before South Carolina, but they're not going to get any delegates out of it.
Right.
So a lot of some Democrats I can see coming over and potentially saying, why don't I play over on the Republican side? And if Chris Sununu, if there are polls showing he's at 20%. And he has the potential to come in second or third or first place in the Republican primary, I could potentially see a lot of independents coming over and supporting him there. But you know what? Bottom line, if he lands up winning New Hampshire, he's going to get the same news coverage Tom Harkin got when he won Iowa in 1992, his home state, or when Paul Tsongas won in when Paul Tsongas won in 1992. He was from Massachusetts, so people said, well, he's from the next state over, so who cares? So he could get a victory in New Hampshire. And I don't see him going anywhere other than that. But I do see him potentially becoming kind of the anti-Trump, kind of go back to the status quo anti the Republican Party before the Trump brigades kind of did a coup d'état there.
Going back a little bit, one thing that I'm I am blind about, and it causes me stress and consternation. And I guess I'm getting less blind about the scales are being. You are removing the scales from my eyes. Is when I not confront, but if I talk to a Trump lover, I would say, why wouldn't you just vote for somebody else who's super conservative, who's more likely to be able to really get the stuff done, like a Liz Cheney? But it really doesn't really have any. It doesn't have so much to do with politics. It doesn't have so much to do with issues. Because if it were just issues, she's crazy conservative. You would just vote for her. And that's why I wonder, why wouldn't people vote for Liz Cheney? She's so darn conservative. And she would probably score a few Democratic votes at the same time. A few, because of the hearings. But it isn't about that at all. It's about identity, like you said before.
But I will say about Liz Cheney is kind of a special case because Donald Trump you got to remember, Donald Trump has redefined what it means to be a conservative. Liz Cheney, she's a status quo ante. She's the status quo before the status quo. Back in the 2004 presidential election, when during the Iraq War, essentially, if you were against the Iraq War, you were seen. Some people would say almost as a traitor. You were seen as you were seen as a liberal. Now Donald Trump changed that in 2015 primaries. There was a scenario where he took on Jeb Bush, George W. Bush's brother, and said the Iraq War was one of the biggest disasters in American history. He said 1 million people died. He said Afghanistan was a disaster. Now, if you listen to members of the Freedom Caucus who have a lot of power in the Republican Party, they talk about warmongers. They talk about the military-industrial complex. This used to be the rhetoric of the left. Now it's the rhetoric essentially of the right. You talk about trade. It used to be the Republicans would say, we're for free, unfettered, we're for free trade. The Democrats, they just want to have more, they just want to have more tariffs. No, we're for free trade. Now, traditional conservatism is essentially, no, we have to take care of our own industries in the United States. We have to put protective tariffs on other countries.
On that, though, they forget that war is great business. That's one thing that
it is.
The Marjorie Taylor Greens don't talk about or address or even seem to think about when they're talking about how expensive the war is. Yeah, it's expensive, but a lot of people buy our products, and it creates a lot of jobs. I don't get that, but that's a micro thing.
It's we're in a scenario right now where the Republicans, at least the insurrectionists in the Republican Party led by Donald Trump, are not favor of military intervention the way they were. Certainly, I mean, George W. Bush in 2005, in his inauguration address, he said that the U.S.'s role was, quote unquote, to end tyranny in our world. Imagine a Republican president saying that today, that essentially in front of this almost democratic imperialism where the United States' role is to go to other countries and essentially show them our way of thinking, and they're going to become these constitutional republics. Now it's essentially, no, it's the United States needs to essentially take care of ourselves. And if we intervene in other countries, essentially, then they're going to, as Ron Paul said, if we're over there, they're going to come over here. So now the Republican Party is completely transmogrified on that. And anybody who has the former position is now, I think, an apostate. Right. That's what Liz Cheney would be.
And one thing I find a little bit odious about that is back in the day of Reagan, Soviet Union was the evil empire. Soviet Union, Russia, evil empire. And now Trump and Green and those in that crew would ally with Russia against Europe. They're more friendly to Russia and Putin than they are to Europe. They're beating Europe down and about all kinds of NATO, not contributing enough. They talk about how we're picking on Russia. Trump talks about how wonderful genius Putin is, wants to be pals with all these dictators, yet always beating down on Europe. I have a personal problem with that.
We're in a different scenario though, because actually that was the one thing during the Cold War that unified the Republican Party, from the conservative members to the more liberal members to the kind of Rockefeller wing. They were all the way to Buckley, Ronald Reagan. They all were unified in the idea that the United States need to take on communism. And there were different gradations. Nixon and Ford, for example, wanted a détente, a relaxation of tensions, whereas folks like Ronald Reagan wanted a more kind of confrontational role. But basically, taking on the Soviet Union was the number one foreign policy goal of the United States in the Republican Party. When the Cold War ended in 1991, there was a split. Folks like Pat Buchanan, who ran for president in 1992 against George H.W. Bush, wanted the party to go back to where it was under, for example, Senator Robert Taft, who was known as Mr. Republican, who was very much a non-interventionist. So the Soviet Union is essentially dissipated now. Now, essentially, we need to take care of it. We need to come home. We need to take care of ourselves. And we need to essentially leave all these alliances. We're only a member of NATO for one reason, to take on the Soviet Union. The Warsaw Pact is now ceases to exist. Let's come home. And then there were other Republicans like Dick Cheney, like Bill Kristol, who essentially said, no, now our job is to bring democracy to all these countries. Now we're the one hegemon. We need to essentially be that one hegemon in the entire nation, and we need to use our power in places like the Middle East. And they said, actually, the Project for a New American Century wrote a letter to Bill Clinton in 1995 saying, now's the time to take out Saddam Hussein. Folks like Pat Buchanan said essentially no. Right now, from essentially during the 1990s through George W. Bush, through John McCain, through Mitt Romney, that's where the party was. They were with the PNAC folks. They were with the people who said essentially we need an interventionist foreign policy, and essentially we need to have this kind of almost bellicose. We need to take on places like Iraq. Donald Trump brought it back to where Robert Taft was, brought it back to where Pat Buchanan was. Where now essentially it's non-intervention, and it's about making America great again, and it's about America first, as opposed to America being part of this kind of family of nations, and essentially being willing to invade a country if they do not meet our demands, which is part of the neoconservative framework.
A little bit of a non sequitur observation from me, and then a question for you.
Yes.
One thing that the Democrats really need to get a handle on. I don't think the Republicans want a handle on it because they want the issue, not the solution. But the Democrats need to get a handle on the border, on the immigration situation. There needs to be a defined, generous, in my opinion, but adhered to strictly policy on immigration that everybody can see, and it's acted upon and it's enforced. That is such an Achilles heel for them. If they could take that issue away from the right, they'd be a lot better off.
Yeah, and this goes back to how Bill Clinton won re-election in 1995. His advisor was Dick Morris. The Democrats had lost 54 seats in the House, 9 in the Senate in 1994 midterm elections. So Bill Clinton hires his old advisor who had advised him in Arkansas, Dick Morris, and Dick Morris comes up with a strategy called triangulation. Essentially, you take the best of both ideologies and you essentially take that, and then you leave the worst of both ideologies for both parties. So in his case,
it seems good.
You have the Republicans here, and the Democrats there. So what would a triangulation be on this issue? Essentially, on the one hand, you take from the Republicans that there should be border enforcement. So you take that. On the Democrat side, you take that we need to do something. Essentially, we need to potentially maybe increase visas. We need to do something to be more compassionate to the asylum process, something like that, and create a third way. This worked completely for Dick Morris and Bill Clinton. You had the issue of welfare reform. Republicans were using it as a cudgel, basically saying the Democrats were a party of welfare. So the Democrats essentially said, okay, we're going to take from the Republican Party the idea that there should be personal responsibility, and we're going to support welfare reform. But we're also going to take the idea from the Democrats that you essentially need more job training. You need to support legal immigrants who came here. You need to be able to support that. You create this triangulation, and Bill Clinton wins in 1996. The Democrats need to do essentially the same thing.
Yes.
Take something from the Republicans, something from the Democrats, and then essentially create this third way. And now, is that going to appeal to people on the far right? Obviously not, but they're not their voters anyway. But that will potentially, it will consolidate their base, and then it will bring over kicking and screaming in some respect in the border enforcement. But it will also, I think, help them with those very elusive marginal voters.
It dilutes the toxicity of that thing that they have to fight against. One question, I have to go because I have another, and my next guest comes on at 12 o'clock. Say someone gives you $100 and says, go to Las Vegas and bet. Who's going to be the next president? And this is not something that I need analysis on. This is you going and plunking down your $100 bill on one person. Where are you going to plunk it down?
Marianne Williamson. No, I'm kidding. Right now, and this is certainly a subject to change. I would say it's going to be Joe Biden.
All right. I wonder what the odds are on that.
I would say that just generally speaking, I think the economy is going to be seen as having an uptick. I think people are going to be very incredulous toward Joe Biden, the person, but Joe Biden in terms of if it's a choice election, and obviously if you go between Joe Biden and Donald Trump, and then any sort of a third party candidate, and there's probably going to be a third party candidate. I think it's probably going to do what Ross Perot did. They're going to essentially they're going to go to their high water mark, and then they're going to kind of have a gradual dissipation as the candidate who mostly is mostly hurt by that says it's a wasted vote. Then voters are going to look at the two kind of as their binary choice. They're going to exclude anybody else, and they're going to go for Joe Biden because they like him, because they essentially, I think it's better. They would like his policies better. They're going to be able to say, well, look what happened, build back anything else. And Donald Trump, frankly, will probably, I don't know whether he would concede or not, but there certainly will be a concerted effort in the Republican Party for somebody else. But unless you have one person that takes up all the anti-Trump votes right now, you're going to have, if you have 17 other people running against Donald Trump, all he needs is that 40%, and he will garner the nomination. And by the way, and I guess this is being kind of trying to hedge my bets as much as possible, I can also see a scenario where Donald Trump is victorious as well.
No hedging. You only have $100 bill, and
I would put the $100 bill today on Joe Biden.
All right. Is that it? Yes. Remind us again about your very cool book. You have others, but yep. This is my favorite. What's the name of it again?
It's the Great American Political Trivia Challenge. Political trivia on steroids, 2,175 political trivia questions available on Amazon.com.
It's crazy if you don't buy it.
I know.
And for me, listen to my album on Spotify. The band is Bridge Bender, and the YouTube travel channel. I have over 100 travel videos. There are going to be a bunch more of Spain and Morocco coming up. That's Bradley J. Travel on YouTube. Look forward to speaking with you again real soon. Rich Rubino. The studio audience is also clapping. You can't quite hear them, but thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Of course, talk to you probably next week.
Absolutely.